Good morning and thank you for joining us for the last webinar in our four-part Fall Tuesdays at 10 series. Today we'll be discussing internal audit for healthcare entities. Our presentation today will last approximately 1 hour, including a Q&A session at the end. If you have a question during the presentation, please submit it using the Q&A function on your Zoom toolbar. Before we begin, we have a few housekeeping items to go over. To receive CPE credit, please view the entire presentation and answer the polling questions as they appear on your screen. These questions will be spread throughout the presentation and will be available for approximately 30 seconds, so your attention is required. To ensure all polling questions appear on your screen, we recommend using a recent version of the desktop Zoom client and minimizing all other windows. If you are viewing this presentation in a group setting, group attendance sheets are available on forvis.com. Finally, if all eligibility requirements are met, the compliance team will send your CPE certificate within 2 weeks via email. And with that, I will hand it over to our two presenters, Christy Clements and Alan Bloom.
Thank you, Olivia. Do appreciate it. Good morning. I'm Alan. Everybody should know me by now, but I am a partner here in the New York office. I am the healthcare market leader for the New York metro area. My background goes about 30 plus years at this point in time, doing consulting and auditing work for not-for-profit and healthcare and for-profit organizations. Very, very embedded in the IDD area, and very happy to be able to speak here today on internal audit with Christy. Christy, if you'd like to give a couple of seconds about yourself too.
Yes. Good morning. I'm Christy Clements. I'm a managing director here at Forvis Mazars, 25 plus years of experience in internal audit, and I am the national industry leader for nonprofit in our national internal audit practice. So it's a pleasure to be here this morning.
Thank you, Christy. And Christy and I now have worked on a number of projects together in the internal audit area. She is an expert in this area, and it's really a pleasure to work with her. And the organizations that we do work with are very, very happy with regard to the products in terms of the work that we do, because it is a very, very important area within the industry to look at internal audit. And as we spoke a number of weeks ago regarding risk management within the organization. So our agenda today, we will cover a number of different items with regard to internal audit, including understanding unique risks within the IDD and behavioral health organizations, key components of an effective internal audit program, tools and techniques for auditing, best practices, and case studies are always great with regard to these types of discussions and programs. And I have the pleasure of talking about the COSO Cube. We've been looking at this cube for at least myself for quite a number of years. At one point, I thought it changed, but it kind of came back to its old essence of where it is. Those in the industry for a while and those new to the industry, very, very important area with regard to our work and what we do, and not just within the fiscal environment within an organization. And when we do look at the COSO Cube and understanding internal audits and what we're looking for is to ensure compliance with regulations, improve operational effectiveness, and mitigate risks within our own business and our strategic objectives at the end of the day, the cube itself does depict the relationship of all aspects within the control environment themselves. And just, when you look at it on the top, we got operations, reporting, and compliance, which are overall big areas within the organization. The control environment, which is, of course, the internal controls that we do work in and want to make sure that we do have the overall culture within the organization. Risk assessment that we spent the whole hour on actually a number of weeks ago with regard to understanding the management of risk within an organization and determining what needs to be done. Control activities, of course, are those that address and mitigate risks with regard to our strategic objectives at the end of the day. Information and communication doesn't really need to be said, but that line of communication is very, very important and really needs to be consistent and transparent with regard to what's going on within the internal control environment within your organization. Of course, monitoring activities and watching that things are being done appropriately. The scope, of course, what we're talking about today is internal audits, financial reporting, operational compliance, and regulatory areas. And we want to make sure that we do understand it, of course, within the overall internal control framework that we are working in. And when you start looking and thinking about our industry, the IDD and behavioral health industry in the New York metropolitan area, very, very focused with regard to compliance, with regard to regulations, ensuring that as we operate these organizations as providers, we do make sure that we comply with all these items on a day-to-day basis. We talk about a number of times over these sessions the Office of Medicaid Inspector General here in New York State. You have the OIG on the federal side. We also have the Justice Department, of course, that's out there behind the scenes, sometimes not behind the scenes with regard to what's going on. But there's a lot more activity with regard to your organizations and what's happening today with regard to the funding levels and where we're moving into the future and changes within the waivers going forward. And when we start thinking about these types of risks and you start talking about consumer care, safety risks, and making sure you have the control environment in place to document very robustly all the things that are being done, not to hit upon every item on this particular page, but just a few of the more important areas. So items like staff training, turnover, burnout, and qualifications on the left side of the page. There are compliance requirements. We do have to have formal training. We need to document that and make sure that that is all being done appropriately. But our employees are the key to our success. And we do need to make sure that we have the appropriate environment with regard to the controls, but also that they are able to do their jobs on a regular basis. Coordination of care with regard to operational risk, staffing and workforce management. Other items like data integrity are going to be very, very important. IT controls and cybersecurity. As I said before, internal audit does not just focus in upon the financial areas of the organization. It does hit upon the operational aspects of the organization, whether it be in programs and making sure things are being complied appropriately. We do work very closely sometimes with your compliance officer within the organization to make sure that things that they're doing are also being documented very robustly at the end of the day. And when you start thinking about regulatory and financial risks down on the right bottom hand side of the page, Medicaid dependency and spend downs. Medicaid is the key to our earnings of dollars within this industry, very much so focused here in New York State with regard to maximizing Medicaid dollars in all the programs that we are operating and also grant funds as we do go forward. Billing and compliance reimbursements, probably one of the bigger areas that we do talk about with regard to making sure that the controls are in place within an organization, documentation requirements, data privacy and security. And when we start thinking a little bit further with regard to these particular areas, and you start thinking about back at your organization, let's not just think about fraud. Let's not just think about the approvals that you need on basic invoices and operational items within the organization, but how about getting into some of the basic areas with regard to our consumers and looking at the backup and their charts and their files and making sure that, for instance, you as a provider are listed as their care provider on their ISPs at the end of the day. There's so many different items that I've seen over the past couple of years with regard to OMIG audits where there's such sloppiness, and it's not intentional, but there's a lot of sloppiness with regard to charts, with regard to information. And when OMIG or somebody does come in to look at it, things are not, that's not really the time to start fixing it. So having a very proactive, preemptive internal audit program is going to be very, very important as we do move into the future. I'd like to jump off the first polling question. So the first polling question that we do have here is, do you have an internal audit function at your organization? 4 different potential answers that we do have here. Yes, it's in-house. Yes, we have it outsourced or co-sourced, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through the presentation. No, what we're planning on implementing one, or no, just a no at the end of the day. I've worked for, again, over 30 years within this industry. A lot of organizations do not focus upon internal audit, nor looking at the controls in the organization a lot of times until it's too late. So it is very important to start thinking about this if you have not gone forward with a particular item. And the results of polling question number 1, yes, they do. In-house, 62%. 23% do not have, but that's a very good percentage at the end of the day. Very happy as part of our start of our discussion here this morning. I'd like to now turn it over to Christy to do some of the heavy lifting with regard to our session.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Well, obviously, we only have an hour, and with 62% of your organizations having an internal audit function, you're probably somewhat familiar with internal audit. So we'll be covering just the key components at a high level today. I think the first thing that we need to cover is this model, which is called the 3 lines model. It is produced by the Institute of Internal Auditors, or the IIA, but it's really powerful in the fact that it clarifies roles and responsibilities, especially in relation to governance, risk management, and internal control. A lot of times we have internal audit functions that don't have the support of a board or don't have rapport with management. And I think this model is really good to look at to determine how things should be implemented so that your internal audit function could be more effective. Before I go into the 3 lines, however, I think it's important to recognize the role of the governing body. And often this is your board of directors or some similar oversight group. This governing body really holds the ultimate accountability for the organization's oversight and governance, ensuring that the organization is operating effectively, ethically, and in alignment with its mission and goals. So they really carry the responsibility to all stakeholders, whether it's investors, clients, employees, the community, clients, customers, making sure they provide sound direction and protect the organization's resources and reputation. With this foundation of accountability in mind, we'll move into the 3 lines. And each of the 3 lines has their own responsibility and roles that they are accountable for. The first line is management and operational functions, right? This is focused on owning and managing the risks and controls that occur daily, monthly, quarterly, etc. Management owns controls, and in order to be effective at owning controls, they have to understand the risks and take action to mitigate those, implementing controls within their day-to-day operations, and that is their responsibility. The second line is a risk and compliance function. This could be legal, compliance, etc. And they support and oversee really the risk management and compliance efforts, really providing guidance. They develop frameworks and monitor to ensure that the first line operates within the organization's risk appetite. So those are all part of management in the organization, and they interrelate. The third line is independent, and independent assurance is their responsibility, and that is internal audit. And this line provides that assurance, independent and objective, on governance, risk, and internal controls. And internal audit evaluates both the first and second line to ensure that these functions operate as intended, and so that you can meet your organizational goals. With all of this said, I think the most valuable aspects of an effective internal audit is the emphasis on collaboration between everything within this graphic. Note the arrows going up, down, and across the organization. That's the information and communication that COSO talked about. It says information should go up, down, and across the organization. So with all levels working together collaboratively, it really does strengthen the overall control environment. I will just say before we move on, without collaboration from management or support from compliance functions or even the board, an internal audit function faces significant challenges in being effective. I mean, that's just the way it is. And sometimes organizations don't do this on purpose. They just don't understand the roles and responsibilities and where they fall into that picture. So we have used this model to help clients improve the effectiveness of their internal audit and transform how they operate within the organization. So when management isn't engaged, auditors may struggle with access to critical information. Without alignment with a compliance function, there may be regulatory issues that get missed. And if you don't have board support, it's really challenging to do much of anything. On the next slide, I just want to provide a high-level overview of the annual internal audit life cycle. So to have an effective internal audit function, it is critical to understand the methodology that occurs on an annual basis. The annual cycle begins with an enterprise risk assessment, or the acronym ERA you may be familiar with. And this is foundational. It involves identifying, assessing, prioritizing the organization's risk, usually conducted annually. Sometimes we see it conducted like a refresh in mid-year. Because they are a point in time, and risks are changing every day. Really right now at an unprecedented pace. To be honest, in my 25 years, I've never seen anything like it. But it really helps us understand the areas that need the focus and need internal audit's attention. The results of the ERA actually inform the annual audit plan, which we draft and then provide to the governing body for their review and comment, and then ultimately their approval. Once the audit plan is approved, then we moved into engagement planning phase for each specific audit, and we'll get into that a little bit more. This phase includes setting clear objectives, defining the scope, creating a work plan for each individual internal audit. And then we move into field work, and that is where we perform our detailed testing, gather evidence, analyze information, and really make observations and recommendations as a result of that. And again, we'll get into that a little deeper here in a moment. And then we get into our reporting. And from there, we're focused on continuous improvement, which is also known as Quality Assurance Improvement Program. It's dictated by our standards. Again, another acronym, QAIP. But that is where internal audit will self-assess what they're doing to make sure, number one, they are working in conformance with the standards, but also adding value to the organization. And to be honest, I've led numerous external assessments because external assessments are required of an internal audit function every 5 years per the standards. And this is the QAIP program is the standard that is most often overlooked. It's not fun to turn the mirror on ourselves and look at what we're doing, but it's absolutely necessary to be effective. So on the next slide, we're going to examine and go into the risk assessment process a little bit deeper, ERA. So again, this is foundational to audit planning. In this phase, and this process is the same regardless of industry. So it's really industry agnostic. We gather comprehensive information from across the organization using really a variety of approaches to ensure that we are capturing a complete picture of the risk at that point in time, but we also want to understand emerging risk. And this is conducted through interviews with key leaders, line level managers who are in the weeds in the day-to-day battles. We want to know where their pain points are and where they struggle and what's working and what's not working. It could be conducted through surveys, through group sessions. We review critical organizational documents like strategic plans, policies and procedures, regulatory reports, etc. So we're taking in all of this information. We assess it based on likelihood. If that risk were to happen, what is the likelihood that it would happen, and what is the potential impact to the organization? These are hard to quantify, so there's a lot of professional judgment that goes into it. And then you map it out on the heat map. So to visualize our findings, we use a heat map like the one you see here, which really categorizes risks by their likelihood and impact. And it helps leadership and your board and even internal audit quickly grasp the areas of greatest concern. And while the risk domains could vary by organization, and we would expect that to occur, there are some that are common. So strategic risk, reputational risk, regulatory and compliance risk, IT risks. We are always looking at risk, first of all, from an inherent perspective. If there were no controls in place, what is the inherent risk? Well, IT and cyber are always going to be at the top. Depending on the industry, it could be compliance or regulatory. If you're in a heavily regulated industry, sometimes those flow to the top just from an inherent risk. But then we consider everything that we've learned through that risk assessment about management's controls that they have in place to mitigate some of these risks. And then we end up with residual risk. And this is how you create your audit plan. The ERA helps us build that plan. It aligns closely, or should, with the organization's key priorities, their risk landscape. It's important to go through this process. As I said, it's foundational. It should be specific to the organization. And please don't use a canned checklist approach because that really does not add a lot of value. On the next slide, once the enterprise risk assessment is complete, the governing body has approved the audit plan, you move into conducting each individual audit. So a well-structured approach starts with notifying the relevant departments of the plan. I've seen organizations, and I think this is a best practice, once that audit plan is approved, it gets distributed to leadership throughout the organization. So it creates transparency, a sense of trust. Everyone's aware of what's on the plan for the year. And then sometimes it just goes to those that will be impacted by the audit, which is important too, so they can plan and plan on timing. But I've seen it done both ways. I think best practice is really to have it sent out to the leaders throughout the organization. At times then, for each specific audit, you start with your planning. The planning phase, to me, is the most critical, and you should spend about 30 to 35% of your planned hours in this phase. We often see a lot of internal audit functions spend most of their time in field work, and that's because, in my opinion, they didn't spend enough time planning. If you do your planning and your planning is robust and you're effective at your planning, then your field work is really only focused on the highest priority risks. And oftentimes we see internal auditors just testing everything, and there isn't a lot of value in testing some of the lower risks. So planning should be 30 to 35% of your project hours. During the planning phase, that's when we begin our research, we gather relevant documents, understand prior audit findings, etc. We hold the kickoff meeting with key stakeholders after we've done some research, and that really sets the stage for that collaboration. But we want to understand from them their perspectives, management, where are your pain points? Where are your areas of concern? Where do you feel our attention needs to be? Because they are the experts in their area. And so it's really critical that you include them. Nothing kicks an internal audit off on the wrong foot more than dictating to management what you're going to do and not listening to them and not taking into account their perspectives. It needs to be collaborative. So after the kickoff, we finalize the audit program, which are our testing steps, and then we move into the fieldwork phase, and we'll cover that in a little bit. Each phase builds upon the other. Again, planning and fieldwork should be the bulk of your hours. The reporting piece really should just be, it's a small phase because you've already done your homework, and there should be no surprises. And we'll talk about some best practices with reporting. It's been my experience that mapping out process flows is considered a best practice. Management often has not seen their function or their processes and process flows. So we'll talk about that in a little bit in the planning phase and aligning your testing approach with that. So going on to the next slide. So tools and techniques, in my 25 plus years, so this goes for planning and field work, I found that there are two tools that are essential to being effective and are most critical: process mapping and data analytics. And each brings kind of unique insights, enhancing our ability to assess the risk and controls thoroughly. But let's go on to slide 12, please. And by visually outlining each step of the process mapping helps us gain a clear understanding of the workflow. So you'll see here, there are different shapes, there are control points. We are able to pinpoint potential gaps or risks that maybe are not mitigated. It really take a closer look at how process mapping enhances our approach and benefits it. It really just begins with how you conduct an effective audit. This first example is very straightforward, right? It's a process map that outlines the financial statement process in a clear, concise, single document, really focused only on the highest pieces of that process. I mean, we can get more granular and it can be multiple pages, but just understanding the processes should fit in a concise single document. You'll notice again the different shapes, manual versus automated processes or controls. It makes it easy to identify where technology is integrated versus human intervention. So it really helps simplify a complex project. Now you'll see on the next slide, there's a second example that really illustrates a claims transmission process for a health system. So that demonstrates that process mapping is valuable not only for financial or operational workflows, but also for IT processes. So every process can be documented in a flow chart. So what stands out here from the first one is just the use of swim lanes. And this is a tool, and swim lanes really organize the flow of information and data across an organization or between departments or even external stakeholders. So you'll see here that they're sending their billings or claims externally through an EDI to payers. It goes through a clearinghouse first. And each of those touch points are risk points for failure. Claims get dropped or they error out because something wasn't complete on the form. And if those are not controlled or monitored for, then you have AR that is continuing to age and the claim never made it to the payer, whether it's a government payer or a commercial payer. So again, this just breaks down a complex process into a clear single document where we're able to kind of filter out what I call the non-critical details or noise in a process that really aren't essential to a risk mitigation standpoint. So the next slide, we have a polling question. Flowcharts are used for the following. Are they used for operational processes only, IT processes only, A only, or A and B?
Christy, I like the use of your swim lanes as a swimmer myself.
Very good.
You went across the lane lines, that's not allowed.
It's we use those most often because rarely does a process stand on its own. It relies on stakeholders both downstream and upstream, and so it's important to show that entire flow of information. That is correct, and 93% of the folks got the correct answer. So thank you for that. Can be used for both. So if you work in internal audit, you probably have heard this before, but process mapping, as I mentioned, is just really an invaluable tool used for planning and field work. It allows us to understand the flow of information, but beyond that, it is so crucial for internal auditors to move away from really the traditional view or reputation we have as internal audit. And when I hear this, when I hear internal auditors say, we're often seen as driving a car by looking in the rearview mirror, we're always looking backwards. They'll have their internal stakeholders or management telling them what, or asking them, why are you always focused primarily on transactions that are 6 or 12 months old or even longer? Things have changed, our risks have changed. So how do we do that? So while testing historical transactions is still important, and there's still a need for that, if internal audit really wants to be of value, you really need to move to more of a strategic view. As mentioned earlier, I think about 30 to 35% of your planned hours should go into your planning steps, and that's how we determine what to test in field work. And by doing that, you're focused on emerging risks, what's important to management, looking at their strategic plan. And as I said, there may be opportunities or times where you're testing historical transactions, usually as part of a compliance or regulatory exercise. But keep in mind, those strategic items are just as important. Let's move away from that rearview mirror and start looking forward. In the next slide, I want to cover how we create our testing steps. And it starts with an acronym that I call ORCA. So objectives, risk, control, and alignment. So the first step is identifying those key objectives in the area that we're auditing. So what are key business objectives? They typically tie out to timeliness, accuracy, could be safety, compliance requirements, completeness of transactions, for example. Understanding these objectives, and I brainstorm with management. What are your key objectives that you are focused on every day related to your responsibilities? And sometimes they're able to verbalize it, and sometimes they have a challenge because they've never thought of it that way. And so it's a really great opportunity for you as risk and control experts and focused on objectives to really help them. It's a teaching moment, collaborate with them, give them a couple of examples. And I find just having kind of a brainstorming session really is very helpful at the start of your audit plan. Next, you consider the risks. And all of these can be documented in an Excel spreadsheet. Just 4 columns is all you need. The first column, objectives. The second column, risks. So for those objectives, you're identifying what risks exist that would keep you from meeting those objectives. And you're going to have multiple risks to one objective, to each objective, and that's to be expected, and that's correct. So you brainstorm and you document the risks in the second column following the objectives, and now you have a view of what matters most to management and from your professional judgment. After identifying those risks, now you sit with management, you say, what controls do you currently have in place to mitigate these identified risks? You may find that they have some gaps. This process will flush those out early. You'll see, okay, you have a gap here. There isn't a control for this risk, and you may move to just making it a recommendation at that point. And this is a process that I've had using this ORCA matrix. A lot of management have used this going forward after internal audit has left the field, has a self-assessment tool really to kind of look at their risks and what controls they have in place, and really to identify proactively what gaps they may have. When you're looking at controls, you need to make sure you have both prevent and detect controls. You need a good mix of controls. Prevent is most ideal, but it's not 100%. Nothing is. So it's important to have those detective controls as well. So hopefully you can point to both types of controls for each risk. And then these controls that you've identified, they are critical because that is where you align your audit plan, and that's the A in ORCA. You are creating your audit plan at that point. Once you know what controls are in place, those are the ones that you're going to be assessing and designing your test plan. And that's the 4th column. So really, by following this ORCA methodology, which is very straightforward, and again, this can be used by management. This doesn't have to just be internal audit, but you ensure really a strategic, risk-based approach to each audit. All right, next slide. So to be more forward-thinking and impactful, we need to incorporate data analytics as a tool as well. And I think that is a key component to an effective internal audit. So by leveraging data, we can provide more timely, insightful analysis, helping to inform proactive decisions and identify emerging risks in real time that management may not be aware of. Oftentimes, I see internal audit using data analytics in the fieldwork phase only. I think it is a best practice to also use it in your planning phase. So by obtaining the data early on and analyzing the data early on, you can look for anomalies or integrity issues in your data that may point to weaknesses in either your application controls or operational controls. So for example, if you're looking at the data, and let's say you're looking at indicative data on your clients or your customers, and you see missing maybe zip codes, how was that record allowed by the system to be created without a date of birth or a zip code or something that may be critical or have an impact later on? That would point to an application control or an input control that is missing that ensures the integrity of your input data. Using data as a diagnostic tool during the planning phase really does enhance and inform your planning process. There have been many times that I've looked at data in the planning process and we start seeing anomalies or we see integrity issues, and that really directs us on where we need to focus. What could be the root cause of those integrity issues? And not only the root cause, but then what is the impact of it? And so that is why you spend so much time in your planning phase, and it will really drive the overall effectiveness and impact of your audit. But then using data during field work also offers powerful benefits, and allows us to analyze an entire population versus sampling. And when we get to the case study, you'll see a great example of this. This approach really yields, again, the meaningful insights from the data itself, revealing patterns or trends that a small sample might miss. I'm going to say probably will miss unless you do very selective sampling. But not only does this enhance the accuracy of your procedures, but it creates efficiencies during field work. Again, you'll see this during the case study, but it helps us identify issues faster and focus our efforts where we're most needed. So it can be leveraged, data analytics, across all types of audits, financial, operational, IT audits. We've used it for fraud detection. We've assisted management by performing ongoing monitoring of an issue that they've had. And again, you'll see this in the case study. So this versatility makes it an essential tool for deeper, more impactful audit. I will say, in the audit functions that I've led throughout my career, there are some folks that shy away from data analytics. They feel like it's too technical for them. Maybe it isn't financially feasible to get everyone trained or get a license for a data analytics tool. But what I have found to be helpful is to have one person who is kind of the data analytics guru. And that person assists the other auditors with analyzing the data, turning around results, and getting the data really ready for analysis. So I would consider that a best practice. Go ahead, Alan.
And I'm sorry, and data is everywhere. So it is very, very important for us to make sure that we are focusing in upon that as part of our tools within the population, to the point that a number of individuals here within the New York office speak at a data conference each year. And it's amazing how every year there's more and interesting topics that come out with regard to not just fiscal areas, but metrics within programs and how we are serving our consumers on a regular basis. And, the sad or hard thing about audits is, hindsight is 2020, and not looking in the rearview mirror like Christy was showing on the first slide of this particular session. It does, though, tell you what has happened. And if we do understand a little bit of the past, we can fix the future and really focus it upon those more risky areas within the organization. So
Exactly.
I totally agree.
Exactly. We have a saying that your data never lies. We've had examples where management had no idea. One particular example comes to mind. every quarter, their auditors were telling them to write up their receivables, and they couldn't understand why their receivables were all over the place. They would pull a report one day and it would show one thing, and the next day it would show a big swing the other way. And within 2 hours, we were able to examine their data and determine that their transactions were not footing across because of a logic error, and that every time they changed an indicative data item, maybe a client called in and changed their phone number or their address, it would write their AR balance to 0. And so we would have not found that out until we looked at the data and saw a trend. And so your data can provide insights that you really need to start with at the planning phase. All right, so the next slide, this is really just some examples and screenshots that highlight the value of visual dashboards. You're taking a great deal of data and you're crunching it down into meaningful information. And I think then the next step after that is just creating these visual dashboards and visualizing the results to communicate the results of your analytic procedures. They can make it easy to see the results, offering a clear, accessible way for management or even us as internal audits to understand the summary of the information. And it also enhances just transparency and communication. It's a great way to baseline too. As Alan mentioned, KPIs, operational metrics. Sometimes we don't know where we stand. And if you don't know where you stand, you don't know where you're going. So using data and using dashboards will help you baseline where you're at. And if you have a strategic plan to move that dial one direction or the other, these dashboards and data analysis is a perfect way to do that. On the next slide, we have a polling question. So using data within the internal audit process is for control testing only, true or false? And I will say, sometimes when you obtain the data, you'll not be able to use it because the integrity of the data is so poor, and that itself informs you of the results. So that is correct. 83% said it's false, which is correct. Data analytics can be used for a number of things, for planning, for baselining, monitoring performance, etc. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about reporting. And this, if you do not conduct your internal audit in a manner that includes management, where we over communicate, this can be very painful. This can be a painful part of the audit process. So I want to talk about some best practices when it comes to reporting. This is where you risk undoing the trust and rapport that you've built during field work, hopefully. To maintain stakeholder confidence, it's important to include your stakeholders or management and over communicate with process and control owners throughout the audit, not just at the kickoff and not just at reporting, throughout the entire process. That may be weekly update meetings, etc. I think it's important, and usually what happens is we get a draft report in the hands of a client or our internal stakeholders, and there's findings in there that they weren't aware of, and they're caught off guard and they're caught by surprise. And that's a big no-no, and that really is indicative that the communication was not what it needed to be throughout the audit process. So over communicate. There should be no unexpected surprises that they're going to see in the draft report. Nothing erodes trust faster than that. Also, accuracy and completeness in reporting, even if it's draft, is equally essential. Our integrity and credibility as auditors really hinges on providing precise and accurate information. Now, that doesn't mean that a finding won't need to be adjusted. Maybe management finally sees it in writing and they're like, oh, we could have provided this other information to you that may change the finding or remove it at all. That happens. But having something that's completely an error, that's a big no-no, and it really erodes your credibility. So try to avoid inaccuracies. I also use the acronym QQFF, and that means qualify, quantify, fair, and factual when it comes to reporting. It is hard at times to quantify and qualify our findings. That is the hardest part. If you use data in your control testing and planning, you're able to quantify things a little easier. You're able to say we tested 20,000 transactions and et cetera, as opposed to sampling where we are probably used to seeing an extrapolation across a population. And while that may be appropriate, I mean, if you use data, you're able to meet the qualification and quantification objectives a little easier. But also make sure your recommendations are practical and actionable. We often see the use of kind of canned recommendations, and you really have to keep your organization and your stakeholders and management in mind. So what makes sense for them? What are they able to do with the resources they have? The goal is mitigating the risk. So how can they mitigate that risk to an acceptable level? There could be 10 different ways to meet that. So don't use a canned approach at all in your reporting. And if you've done proper planning and field work and communicating throughout the entire process, the report process should just be a formality. There's no surprises. Management's already aware of what they should expect to see in the report.
No surprise with management, but wait till you get to the audit committee.
That's right. That's right. Well, hopefully they're preparing their leaders for it as well.
We hope so. We hope so.
Yes. So in this slide, just beyond the data analysis and process mapping, there are essential soft skills that are needed as internal auditors and some best practices that could greatly enhance the effectiveness of internal audit and make your job easier every day. I think first it's crucial to engage management and staff. And you know what? This really goes both ways. If you are not part of your internal audit function, but you are a leader within your organization, reach out to internal audit if you have a question or a concern about something. I think just going back to that 3 lines model where we saw the arrows going a number of directions, internal audit wants to help, and they have a skill set to help. Even if it doesn't turn into a project, internal auditors are, by their standards, allowed to conduct consulting procedures, or maybe it's just a discussion to help you work through if a planned control is designed appropriately. So it's crucial to engage with each other. But as internal auditors, definitely engage with management and staff throughout the audit process, building those relationships and gaining that buy-in from leadership early on really helps ensure a smoother process for reporting, implementing audit recommendations, and it's just important to be collaborative. Also, providing recommendations, make sure they're actionable. They need to be tailored to address specific needs rather than generic fixes. Also, we have to do follow-up, right? So we make these recommendations, management provides action plans, usually a date by when they plan to remediate it and a responsible party. Internal audit should be following up on those items based on the timeline of planned remediation. Sometimes it's performed just through inquiry only, depending on the risk level. If it was a medium to low risk, you may just inquire about the remediation efforts. Management may say it's fully remediated and you check it off your list and move on. If it's something that was a critical risk or higher, you may want to perform procedures to validate that management implemented as the corrective action as they said they did, and that it's operating as management intends. But that really varies by organization, and it can be on a case-by-case basis based upon the recommendation. And then finally, continuous improvement is key. So conducting that self-assessment at the end of each project, please inquire either through survey or whatever of your stakeholders. What went well during the project? What could have been improved? And then take that feedback and implement it from there. Now we'll move on to a polling question. Quality assurance does not apply to internal audit. True or false?
And it's interesting, Christy, as you were talking about it, but internal audit should be your friend. We should use internal audit, of course, to better the organization. We want to find things if there are issues internally. We don't want outsiders to find them. We want to be able to fix them, but it's also efficiency purposes and making sure that we are doing things correctly. I keep on thinking about a movie that my kids love, Nemo, and I think about the shark scene where the fish are our friends, if anybody remembers that. So internal audit really is our friend, and we really need to use them appropriately for the betterment of the organization.
That's exactly right. Thank you for that. That is something that we as internal auditors try to stress often. So 86% said false. That's correct. And really, quality assurance applies to everyone, and internal audit should hold themselves just as accountable as anybody else. And in fact, it's required of the standards. And in fact, an external quality assurance project assessment is required of internal audit functions every 5 years by the standards. So next, we're just going to move into a case study that we performed several years ago related to medication inventory controls within a health system pharmacy. And, you know, this is a process that touches on procurement, storage, security, and ordering as far as our review. But you'll see here on this slide, as part of this case study, when you think of medication inventory controls within a health system, it can touch on a variety of different areas, from compliance to error handling to disposal to staff training. So when we started our planning process, we started with flow charting the process from beginning to end. Where does medication inventory controls begin? Well, it begins with the procurement of pharmaceuticals and drugs, and who has the ability to do that. And so we mapped that entire process out at a high level, and we quickly became aware of a segregation of duties issue. This particular pharmacy was very small with limited staff, but there was one person who had the ability he was responsible for ordering the drugs, receiving the drugs, checking the drugs into inventory, disposing of them, and then conducting the routine inventory of the drugs. So obviously, this posed a huge risk for drug diversion, especially controlled substances, as part of the procurement process. So the risk was, you know, drugs are being ordered without making it into the inventory system. And we could not identify a control as we went through the ORCA with management that would detect this if this happened. If drugs were ordered and pocketed and only some of them were checked in, it would not be detected. It would not be detected if a drug was ordered that wasn't needed, and how would anyone know? And so to address our testing, the concern with management was, have we had an issue where any drug, but especially controlled substances, have been ordered and did not make it into the inventory system? So we started with our flow chart. That's where and the ORCA, and that's where we flushed out the segregation of duties issue, and that there were no preventative or detective controls that would identify if there were pharmaceuticals purchased that didn't make it into the inventory system. So we use data analytics for our testing, and we were able to obtain a data file from the pharmaceutical wholesaler detailing all daily drug orders by NDC and class over a 2-year period. So we looked at 68,400 purchase lines, with a dollar value of about $1 billion. And we did this test in a 3-hour period. We obtained a data file from the drug inventory system for the same period of time, matched everything up by date, by order, by dollar amount, by NDC and class code. We matched that against the inventory system with no exceptions. So management was able to feel confident in the last 2 years there weren't any purchases of drugs that did not make it to the inventory system. We examined the handling of controlled substances, especially around approvals. We did make a recommendation there because this individual was able to order all different classes of drugs without anyone else putting their eyes on it. So we made a recommendation there, which they agreed to. But while it would have been a great recommendation to add more people, to add the appropriate segregation of duties to this process, it wasn't financially feasible. They were not able to do that. So this is where those common sense or practical recommendations come in and are important. It needs to be actionable. So what we decided to do is we've already built out this script, this monitoring. We proved that it was easy to do. And so on a monthly basis, we would obtain this data from both sources, run this quick script, and turn over the results to management to act upon. And so it became a monitoring tool for internal audit and management. So we were able to examine thousands of transactions over a 2-year period. And like I said, it took us like 3 hours to complete this test. Had we done a more manual approach with sampling, it would have taken much longer. And I would like to say data analytics does not take the purchase of a license for a powerful tool. Keep in mind, Excel is very powerful. If you have someone who is trained on Excel, it can be just as powerful a tool. And so, like I said, by visualizing the process in a flow chart, we were able to identify where the highest risk was and that there was a segregation of duty issue. And so I really think this case study highlights some of those best practices and a great outcome.
Definitely agree. And, when I think about big health system, that's a very excellent example. Bringing it down to the IDD industry and looking at a group home, we do have medication and drugs in the group home. While we might not be purchasing them ourselves, but we do have a lot of protocols with regard to dispensing, preparation, and making sure we've documented it appropriately for our consumers on a regular basis. And when we start thinking further about internal audit with regard to all the things that you talked about today, Christy, we had a lot of people at the first slide in the poll that we had that they do have an internal audit section, talking to a lot of internal audit professionals within private organizations. There are various ways that a CPA firm can also help, because there might be specialized areas that you might not have familiarity with, and just need that little bit of expertise with regard to there. And what I found over the years also, that organizations that don't have internal audit and really want to get their feet wet, you can start by outsourcing a little bit of project here, a project there, or we can do agreed upon procedures or some type of project with regard to specific areas within your organization that might be of concern. And like I said before, it's a good thing. It's something that could help you as you do go forward with regard to the entire process. So Christy, excellent job with regard to the session today. I think we give it back to Olivia for some CPE and administrative items.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for joining our webinar today. You will receive the presentation materials via email within the next few days. If you want to learn more or have further questions, you can reach out directly to Alan or Christy, whose contact information is in the handouts. As a reminder, this was our last webinar in our Fall Tuesdays at 10 series. However, stay tuned for our spring series that will be posted in March. Additionally, if you're not already signed up for our Forvis Mazars foresights, You can receive notices about more webinars like this one, along with articles, white papers, and live events specific to the healthcare industry. Sign up today at forvismazars.us/subscribe. And finally, just a few CPE reminders. Certificates will be emailed within 2 weeks. If you have questions regarding CPE, please contact our Learning and Development team at cpecompliance@us.forvismazars.com. Thanks again for attending our webinar and have a great day.
Thank you.